Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Tomorrow, Ontario Justice Paul Rouleau will begin a public inquiry, and at issue is the Trudeau government's invocation of the Emergencies Act. Never used before, the act was brought in to respond to the occupation by protesters of the parliamentary precinct last winter. And in invoking the act, the Trudeau government was able to break up public assembly, banks given the right to freeze accounts without justifying it in court, and civil liberties, well, they were curtailed. So at issue for this inquiry in the days and weeks ahead, was the Trudeau government justified in using the act, or was it an overreach? In the next hour, we will examine that issue with some key players, but we want to begin here with CPAC's Andrew Thomson as he takes a look at how we got here.
They came in January. Hundreds of trucks and vehicles, thousands of protesters.
We are here for our children's futures and our children's freedom.
Organizers vowed to stay as long as it would take to end all COVID-19 mandates. Others demanded the outright removal of the Trudeau government as they joined the shutdown of Ottawa's downtown core. A well-funded, well-supplied occupation that brought a playground atmosphere, along with harassment of residents and business owners. And criticism. Police were either unable or unwilling to take control. Conservatives were divided over the shutdown, but the current leader was clear.
I'm going to look for an opportunity to bring coffee and support and friendship for peaceful, law-abiding, hardworking, freedom-loving truckers.
The Prime Minister took a different view.
There is a right to make your voices heard loudly and clearly. There is not a right to shut down our democracy or our democratic processes. There is not a right to abuse, intimidate, and harass your fellow citizens.
But as the convoy grew more established and more emboldened, there were calls for a stronger response.
Do something. Doing nothing and promising to do nothing encourages those people to stay there.
The federal government has to stop using jurisdiction as an excuse for inaction. It's simply wrong.
By then, the blockades had spread to border crossings in Western Canada and to Windsor's Ambassador Bridge, cutting off a vital trade artery. Ontario eventually declared a state of emergency to clear protesters. 3 days after that, the federal government invoked the Emergencies Act. It gave the RCMP power to enforce provincial and municipal law, power for banks to freeze accounts, and power for the government to suspend truck insurance and target crowdfunding platforms and payment providers. Justin Trudeau deemed it reasonable and a last resort.
This has gone on far too long. It is no longer a lawful protest at a disagreement over government policy. It is now an illegal occupation. It is time for people to go home.
And restrictions.
Conservatives called the emergency declaration a sledgehammer. The Bloc also opposed the move, but the NDP provided reluctant backing.
We will withdraw our support if at any point we feel these powers are being misused.
By the time Parliament confirmed the declaration, police had already moved against the occupation zone in Ottawa. Arrests were made, trucks were towed, and banks froze more than 200 accounts before the order was revoked on February 23rd. Invoking the Emergencies Act requires a public inquiry into the basis for the declaration, the measures used, and if changes are needed. The Public Order Emergency Commission, led by Ontario Judge Paul Rouleau, must report to Parliament by February. And over the next 6 weeks, he's called 65 witnesses, from the convoy leaders facing criminal charges, to police, federal and municipal leaders, and groups representing Ottawa residents. And we'll hear from the key people who made the call to invoke the Emergencies Act, cabinet members and the Prime Minister himself. For CPAC, I'm Andrew Thomson.
Now, the Prime Minister was asked about the Emergencies Act public inquiry today. Take a listen to what he had to say.
The convoy blockades of last winter massively disrupted the lives of Ottawa residents, of people relying on supply chains that come across the borders. It was something that Canadians experienced with real concern, which was why we moved forward with measures that are not to be taken lightly, but that we brought forward with the Emergencies Act in a time-limited, measured way to be able to get the situation back under control. And that's exactly what we did. But part of that process is to ensure that there is proper accountability and proper oversight after the fact. And that's why there is a public inquiry into the use of the Inquiries Act, so that Canadians can understand what and how these powers were used. That's why from the very beginning I offered to the Commission to appear at that Commission so that Canadians could understand exactly why we had to do what we did, why we didn't enter into those decisions lightly, but why it was necessary to restore order to Canada, to Ottawa and to parts of the country that were under real challenges. I look forward to the work that the Commission is going to do, and I know a lot of answers that Canadians have will be answered by that Commission. A lot of questions Canadians have will be answered by that Commission.
Now, the protesters numbered into the thousands at the time, and while many did come to push back on COVID-19 rules and regulations, Canada's intelligence community had concerns. As we heard from journalist Justin Ling at the time, security experts were concerned about individuals within the convoy who were promising a civil war and threatening attacks on politicians. Justin Ling joins us now in Montreal. Justin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Listen, as Justice Rouleau begins his work, I wanted to ask you to describe the protest, because there were those who came to speak out against mandates, whole families really who came out to support protesters who they saw being sympathetic to them being sick of government regulations. But there were also more radicalized elements that you reported on. What stood out for you about who came out or who stepped forward to organize all of this?
Yeah, so I mean, from the outset, my attention was paid primarily to those who actually organized this thing, right? The influencers, the activists, the organizers who actually put out the call for people to come to the city, who have spread misinformation, disinformation about vaccines and about the government, who have, in some cases, built little movements of people who have organized against the vaccines, against Justin Trudeau, against public health measures, in favor of conspiracy theories and quack remedies for COVID-19. And those people are several of the names that you hear all the time. People like Tamara Leach, people like Pat King, people like Chris Barber. Some of them we're going to hear from over the course of this commission. Some of them who have been a little bit less public-facing, people like James Bowder, people like someone we actually have heard from recently, Jeremy McKenzie, who organized some of the more radical elements that you mentioned. If you look at the organizers and the influencers, the people who actually put those calls out to the public, who actually got people to the Capitol, who actually did the logistics of pulling this crazy effort off, those type of people are folks who have a very paranoid view of how this country operates, who genuinely believe that there is a deep state cabal that is really pulling the strings, that the vaccines are not only deadly but have racked up tens of thousands of deaths, that the government is covering it up. These are people who believe that the government is illegitimate, has not only broken Canadian law and the Canadian Constitution, but international war crimes laws in some cases. These are people who have written manifestos calling for the government to be removed. These are the people who I've been focusing on since the very beginning. Now, just briefly, there were a ton of people who came out, more than 10,000 people on that first weekend of the convoy arriving in Ottawa, and more than 1,000 of others who stayed for weeks on end. These people have a litany of different grievances. Some of them have been taken in by this misinformation, some of whom just oppose lockdowns and curfews, as many people in this country did and still do. Some of these people are well-intentioned but misled. Some of these people are radicalized. Some of these people do want to, for example, example, hang the Prime Minister and lock up the chief public health officers across the country. So there was a real mixed bag of people who came out to voice their support for this convoy and who enabled this ongoing occupation.
As you say, a mixed bag with certainly elements that you reported on that is concerning to security officials way even beyond the Canadian borders. But I think it's worthwhile to talk about the messaging here too, because more than 6 months later, people may have already forgotten. But there was a call to overthrow the Trudeau government by having the Senate and the Governor General dissolve Parliament to create a provisional government instead, where protest leaders would be named to that, I guess, governing council. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I mean, the foundational document of the so-called Freedom Convoy is a memorandum of understanding written by James Bowder through his group called Canada Unity. It was the document that propelled a previous convoy to Ottawa that never really took off. It is a document that was signed by hundreds of thousands of people. It was a document that was being shared around and spread around and pumped up by people who joined this convoy, including many of the organizers. It's a document that, like you said, basically purports to have the legal weight to remove the government, to call new elections, to install a new government or a new prime minister, to basically have the Governor General and the Senate and this group, this Canada Unity organization, become a sort of junta for the country, right? A complete nonsense legalese. Now, there's a ton of people who are involved with the movement who say they wanted nothing to do with this memorandum of understanding, that it never spoke for them, that this was just one guy's idea. Again, it was signed by north of 100,000 people, but nevertheless, putting even that aside, which was clearly a misguided effort to sort of use a totally arcane legal mechanism that is totally nonsense to get their way. There were a number of people, I would say upwards of hundreds, if not into the thousands of people, who either on stage, on social media, on their signs, in chatting with journalists and other people at these occupations, voiced support for the idea that the Prime Minister, the whole government, health ministers, chief public health officers should be rounded up, should be put on trial, and should in some cases be jailed or executed. That was an idea that was unfortunately very common on the streets of Ottawa during those weeks. And of course, it was an idea that has percolated throughout. This very paranoid movement is an idea that has percolated throughout the anti-vaccine movement. In fact, people may already have forgotten, but there was an arrest made of a number of people in Coutts, Alberta, and charges were laid for them allegedly plotting to kill RCMP officers and potentially other members of representatives of the state. So I don't think we should ever discount the degree to which there was a belief that ran through this movement that the government is illegitimate because it pushed vaccines.
It's interesting that you mentioned Coutts, Alberta, because they did. They found a cache of weapons. They were charged with conspiracy to murder police. So I wonder then, because so much of the focus has been on the Ottawa police, how they failed to act or did not act strongly enough. But I'm wondering if overall, when it came to policing and who was meant to oversee and make sure this didn't become a security issue, where the disconnect was, where was there a failure of understanding?
I mean, it's such a difficult question because, the Ottawa police have always been very proud, and rightfully so, in their baseline that they want to let people protest, even if it's annoying, even if it's inconvenient, and they don't want to be the arbiter of what is and is not legitimate speech, within reason, of course. And I think at the outset of this convoy arriving in the city, they maintained the posture that this is disruptive, it is annoying, it is unpleasant, but it's their right to do so. And again, it's hard to say that they were wrong because we have to preserve a baseline in this country that people are allowed to come and voice their concerns, exercise their freedom of expression, even if it's over something that we all disagree with, right? And I think that has to be kind of the starting point for all of this. Now, taking all that into account, it's very clear to me, and I think to a lot of people, and I think it will become clear through this commission, that the Ottawa Police do not only preserve and protect that freedom of expression, but also were lax in their attitude to the entire kind of logistical and security threat posed by this occupation. They should have known from the outset that the plan was not for just a weekend occupation, but for a longer stay in the capital right downtown. They should have geared up in terms of personnel and infrastructure to figure out how to manage the logistical challenge of all these trucks. They should have never let these trucks occupy downtown Ottawa. While these folks absolutely have the right to come and be disruptive and annoying, they didn't necessarily have the right to use these massive rigs to do so. So there was a lot of points at which you can point to and say the Ottawa police were not prepared, did not have foresight, did not have the intelligence, did not have the forward planning, and I think we're going to learn a lot more about all of those particular points as this commission goes forward.
Okay, well, as we talk about this commission of inquiry, we're going to see and hear from the Prime Minister giving testimony really to a same body that will also hear from protesters who are calling for Trudeau's overthrow. What do you think might come out of all of that?
You know, I think it's the Prime Minister's opportunity and obligation to finally kind of give us the full start-to-finish story of why the Emergency Act was invoked, all the steps that were taken short of that to try and manage this occupation, to underscore some of the security briefings he was getting about the possible threat posed by this group and other groups across the country, and to kind of fill us in on some of the both economic costs of all of this, but also the diplomatic and trade costs. Of course, we know the United States was quite incised over the blockages along various points of the border. So I think it's the first real opportunity we're going to have to hear him tell that whole story start to finish. That being said, I really hope the Commission also focuses on the points at which he egged on, in some cases, this movement and this occupation, because I think when the Conservative Party attacks him for doing so, they're quite right. I mean, he repeatedly insulted and belittled this movement in a way that was almost certainly not helpful and almost certainly harmful, and in many cases, I think actually exacerbated the situation, encouraged the sort of momentum behind this group, and fed into some of their victim narratives.
Okay, but the question at hand really for this Commission of Inquiry is to determine whether or not the invocation of the Emergencies Act was justified. And I appreciate you're not a legal expert here, but what comes to mind when you consider the question of legitimacy?
I think it's an incredibly good question, and frankly, it's been very frustrating to watch the conversation play out around the Emergencies Act, because a lot of the overheated rhetoric, I think, is really based on the sort of unfortunate relationship between this act and the War Measures Act, right? The War Measures Act was an inherently overbroad, ham-fisted, dangerous piece of legislation that amounted to a full frontal assault on the civil liberties of this country, especially when it was deployed by Trudeau's father. Now, the Emergencies Act was drawn and written up in such a way designed to curtail those risks and sort of encapsulate the Emergencies Act inside the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a very, very good thing. Now, that should not be carte blanche to use it whenever a government feels inconvenienced or threatened, but it also does provide a constitutional and civil liberties protecting roadmap to invoking the act. And I think some people have attacked it as though it is still the sort of odious piece of legislation that preceded it. I really want to hear from the Prime Minister, from the government, from the ministers, from police, exactly how the act and the orders around it were written up, exactly how it was invoked. And I hope that in so doing, we can actually get an appreciation for the sort of red lines of when this act should and should not be invoked. Because we do, as a country, need a piece of legislation that could handle emergencies. We should not be afraid of invoking it. There should not be a big, only break in case of emergency box around it necessarily. But we also have to get an understanding for how it should be invoked, how it can be managed, and how it can be reviewed after the fact. And that's what this is all about.
Justin, really good to speak with you. Thank you for that.
Thanks for having me.
That's journalist Justin Ling in Montreal. For the City of Ottawa, the Convoy meant lost sales amounting somewhere between $44 million and $200 million. But for people living in Ottawa's downtown core, it was about a loss of safety and security in their own neighborhood. Lawyer Paul Champ has been working on behalf of residents and businesses in Ottawa's Centretown community. He joins us now. Mr. Champ, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Now, amongst the people speaking will be your client, Zexi Lee. She'll be appearing before the inquiry as she, for people who may have forgotten, is the Ottawa resident who sought and with your representation got an injunction against the blaring horns in the city's downtown core. What do you hope the inquiry gets from her?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Miss Lee is going to be testifying about the experiences of downtown residents. There's going to be a few other witnesses who testify about that, but Miss Lee had not only her own personal experiences, but she was also trying to assist other people in her building who were more vulnerable, seniors who couldn't go outside and so forth. So she'll be talking about those experiences, as well as the serious harassment that she experienced once her name became known and associated with the horn injunction. So that will be her part in the inquiry.
How serious did the harassment get?
Well, the Ottawa Police and the RCMP were in regular contact with us. At one point her address was doxed, as they say, and there were some threats online. The Ottawa Police did a couple of times come to her apartment without us calling, like they came because of intelligence they were getting. So it definitely was a very unpleasant and scary experience for her.
And again, all related to the protest itself. Now, you also represent business and community associations from Ottawa's Centretown area. Talk to us about how they were affected by the occupation, what you hope comes out of their testimony before the inquiry.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not sure how much people from across Canada understand about how profoundly impacted the residents and businesses and workers of downtown Ottawa were. Because of the trucks covering such a large area, it was almost impossible to get in and out of downtown Ottawa with vehicles. The trucks were idling all the time, so that the diesel fumes for anyone who had respiratory issues or didn't have respiratory issues were having breathing problems. And then the horns, the horns were absolutely deafening and were going on for several hours every day, early in the morning to late at night. Fireworks were going off in the middle of the night, like shooting off people's windows. There was gas cans and propane tanks everywhere, right beside open fires. And businesses had to shut down. The vast majority of businesses in downtown Ottawa shut down because they simply couldn't operate. They couldn't get their supplies in. Customers weren't coming, and to the extent they opened their doors, they would often be overrun with large numbers of the Convoy protesters who refused to wear masks and became belligerent and aggressive if they were asked to wear masks. So, it was really a terrible time for the people of downtown Ottawa.
Mm-hmm. So businesses, associations, individual residents, all affected by this protest. And earlier today we were speaking with journalist Justin Ling, and he has reported extensively on some of the more troublesome elements of the protest, in particular some of the organizers behind this protest. Do you have any concerns? Did you have any concerns about the individuals involved and dissenting in the Ottawa area?
Well, Michael, I think there was a real big mix of people who came to Ottawa for those protests. There's no doubt that, a lot of people in Canada, well, everyone in Canada were affected by the lockdowns and, caused a lot of distress to everyone. It was hard for everybody. And, some people, unfortunately, reacted in a different way and became very fearful for themselves and their families and were opposed to vaccines. And, people like that who were just opposed to the vaccines and the vaccine passports and issues like that, and they wanted to protest that. That was fine, but there was a lot of other elements for sure in those groups who I think, unfortunately, were maybe exploiting other people who were simply protesting because they were concerned about vaccine passports.
Mm-hmm. I want to pick up on that because, of course, here you are famously a human rights lawyer, as someone who has fought for the protection of civil liberties in this country. Did protesters go too far in their actions in trying to express their opinions?
Yeah, Michael, I'm a big believer in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms being like the defining values of Canada. And, freedom to protest, freedom of assembly, freedom of association are core fundamental freedoms in our country and in any democratic society. So, you know, when these protesters first arrived in Ottawa, I fully supported their right to protest. You know, there was going to be some inconvenience. There was going to be some interference with day-to-day lives of other people in Ottawa, but that goes along with protests and demonstrations. When people come together to protest, whatever the cause, whatever the issue, that's generally a great thing for democracy. People organizing together is something that should be celebrated and generally not investigated. But what happened in Ottawa definitely did cross the line. You know, it took me several days to really kind of process about the impact of what was going on in Ottawa, and the trucks, the semi trucks that were parked everywhere, 400 semi trucks, you know, bumper to bumper, throughout residential neighborhoods, idling all the times and blasting those deafening horns was really something else. You know, people can protest, but trucks aren't people. And it became clear that it was really causing a lot of harm to the people in Ottawa, and you know, ultimately was crossing a line. And that's how, you know, we got involved and have been working on this case ever since.
Mm-hmm. Working on it even before the Emergencies Act was invoked. But, you know, really when we talk about this commission of inquiry, it's there to determine whether or not the government was actually justified in invoking the act. From where you stand, from a legal point of view, do you think the bar was met for the invocation?
Well, you know, Michael, the group that we're representing, the Ottawa Coalition of Businesses and Residents, we aren't taking a formal position on the invocation of the Emergencies Act. You know, was the formal criteria met? But we are wanting to see that it's clearly on the record that there was chaos and disorder in Ottawa for a prolonged period of time. You know, people weren't able to make medical appointments. People weren't able to get groceries. People weren't able to use public transit. People weren't able to work. And that there were failures here. You know, the fact that the Ottawa police and other police services weren't able to effectively respond in the first few weeks of that protest is a serious concern. And, you know, we definitely want it on the record about how people in Ottawa were impacted. And we're looking forward to learning, you know, where the breakdowns were, why there could not have been more effective action earlier in that protest.
Paul, really appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thanks so much, Michael.
And that's Paul Champ. Now, the inquiry will spend about 6 weeks hearing from witnesses, and by next February, it will table a report to Parliament. Now, what it will say about the use of the Emergencies Act is, of course, not yet known, but Keith Wilson is a lawyer who has counseled members of the Convoy protest, and he says the invocation will go down as a disgrace in Canadian history. Keith Wilson joins us now. Mr. Wilson, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Now, this inquiry, it is looking into the invocation of the Emergencies Act, whether or not it was justified or an overreach on behalf of the government. And you've already stated, insinuated that it was an overreach. Why have you come to that conclusion?
Well, we're under law. We know that this is the successor to the War Measures Act. The legislation's only supposed to be invoked by cabinet when we're facing an extreme existential threat to the country, to the nation, to our, you know, the enemy is within the border type of a situation. And what we know was happening when the Emergencies Act was invoked, when the cabinet decided to invoke it on the Sunday evening of the 13th of February, that weekend, the border blockades at Coutts and at Windsor had cleared. Those borders were all open. The only protest left in Canada at that time was the protest in downtown Ottawa. And over that weekend, myself as one of the lead counsel for the Freedom protesters had negotiated with them a deal with the Ottawa City Mayor to de-escalate the situation in Ottawa.
So a deal, as you said, between the organizers and the Ottawa Mayor. But really, what would that have done? How would that have ended the protest? Because to my understanding of it, it was just about moving vehicles rather than vacating the parliamentary precinct.
Well, the main point of aggravation was the number of large trucks and protest vehicles in the downtown core. And in the downtown area, of course, there's hotels and there's there's business towers, but there's also condo towers and there's apartments. And so the concern that some of the trucker leaders had was sort of overstaying the welcome, de-escalating tensions. And there you can see on the screen the trucks moving. So the arrangement that the mayor's vision was de-escalate the pressure on the downtown core, consolidate the trucks to the extent there was still space on Wellington, and then move the balance out of town to these remote locations that had been set at Armpar and another place. And then the truckers could shuttle in on buses, shuttle buses that were already in place, and attend protests during the day, but move the protest vehicles out of the downtown core to allow normalcy to come. And that was the vision that the mayor had. The trucker leadership agreed to it, and we were well on our way to implementing it on the Monday.
Well, the mayor of Ottawa is Jim Watson currently. He says he will not comment on the deal because he will be appearing before this inquiry. But there is a spokesperson for the public safety minister. And according to this spokesperson, Cabinet did monitor actions after that deal was struck. And apparently they saw the deal being denounced by key organizers, which in part is why they moved forward with the Emergencies Act. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what they have to say when they're under oath and cross-examined, because here's the facts. That there was strong buy-in from the truckers to make this move to de-escalate. The facts speak for themselves, which are on the Monday morning. After Sunday night, there was a logistics meeting at City Hall with one of the superintendents of police, the city manager, the head of emergency services, some of my legal team, and the trucker leadership. And they put a plan together that they implemented Monday morning. It resulted in 102 vehicles leaving the downtown, 42 of which were large trucks. 23 went up onto Wellington, as you can see on the screen, with police escort. And then the balance left town. We cleared 2 city blocks. We were on track to, the mayor agreed, and it's right in the letter that's publicly available and is filed in evidence, that the mayor recognized that this was a large logistical exercise and it could take 3 days to clear the downtown, but for Wellington. And that's what we were on track to do. We made great progress on the first day, cleared 2 blocks, and we were on track. And then we had problems on the Tuesday with miscommunication. There were so many different police agencies from Windsor and Kingston and different police forces. The communications between the police were really bad. And as we kept trying to move, we got blocked. And then on the Wednesday, I got a phone call from the city manager because we got blocked again as we were trying to do further moves. And he said that the new interim chief, as well as the federal government, didn't want the deal to go ahead. And it was stopped at that time. So they ended up bringing in police on the Friday and beating up and arresting Canadian protesters, clearing downtown by Sunday. If we hadn't had those interventions, we were on track to have the downtown opened up by the Wednesday.
So the fact that there were 1 or 2 organizers on social media denouncing the deal is inconsequential?
Yeah, well, I mean, this was an organic event. There was, when I was in the logistics center, the operations center, we'd get a report that 20 trucks were arriving, from Kitchener, and then 30 trucks were arriving from Nova Scotia, and there was a convoy. Like, it was like, where, who, what? This was not like an orchestrated event. It was purely spontaneous. And so the idea that there was some central command that could make everybody comply was just not how it worked in the real world. And it was all moral suasion. The buy-in was terrific. It was proven by the fact that the first 2 blocks that we attempted to clear were completely cleared out of all protest vehicles. Now, it is true that the vehicles were consolidating onto Wellington, but that's where the grievance was. The grievance was with the federal government and the COVID mandates. And, interestingly, I just went for a walk. Wellington's closed right now. It's been closed ever since by the government. So with the barricades that they have up. So the reason that I and others believe this was an overreach, there wasn't a national security incident to begin with. The basic trigger to meet the law wasn't there. And what's troubling for me and others is that had there not been these interventions, we knew that the borders were open on the weekend. well, all that was left was Ottawa. We had a deal working with the mayor and his vision to restore his downtown to the residents and businesses, and we were well on track to implementing that until it got stopped.
Well, respectfully, Mr. Wilson, there may be residents out there, many of Ottawa Centretown, businesses as well, people that lost money, lost their shifts, felt trapped in their home, that might argue that there was a security threat, a security to their person, not having the freedoms that they should be having because of this protest. What do you say to those individuals who may be more sympathetic to the use of the Emergencies Act?
Well, the crime data is empirical. Crime dropped, so that's going to come out. There's not even anybody suggesting that anymore. That narrative's gone.
But does that mean to say that individual residents were not harassed or felt trapped in their home?
Well, I'm not. I don't think they were harassed. That's not the prevailing thing, the evidence that I've seen and I observed my firsthand. But let's talk about something that's clear, which is they were inconvenienced. It wasn't a pleasant experience for some of the residents, for sure. In the same way that it wasn't a pleasant experience for Canadians to be facing mandates to
but these individual residents did not enact rules and regulations. They were just living their lives.
Fair enough, sir, but they chose to live in the capital city. And if you're going to suggest that the protesters should have gone to some remote rural community and protested there, when you live in the capital city and you enjoy the benefits of the incredible architecture and capital infrastructure that's here, we all know that protesters come here. This is not novel. You know well that the capital city of a country, of a nation, is where people go to protest when they feel their governments have crossed lines. That's what happened on a grand scale.
But I think though, the difference being that when there have been protests in the past, it might be a march to the Hill, it might be a protest on the Hill, certainly not an occupation that lasts day after day and into weeks. So very different, and certainly not protests that in the past have involved big rigs that are honking horns 24/7 and emitting carbon into the air that people are choking on. What do you say to that?
Never before in our history, sir, has a government, the federal government, invoked mandates that prevented 6 million unvaccinated Canadians from traveling by plane and train in their country, the second largest country in the world by landmass. Never before did thousands of people who worked at airports, baggage handlers, clerks, security people lose their jobs because they exercised their choice over bodily autonomy. I can keep going. Military, the number of people that have left our military that we invested in all their training because they were concerned about the uncertainty around the rushed approval of the vaccine. This was an incredibly, I know you're not going to suggest to me that the pandemic was a minor event, nor that the government's response was unprecedented. Unprecedented action by government will bring unprecedented response, I would suggest, by its citizens when they think the government's gone too far. And that's what happened in January and February in Ottawa.
Yeah, I think so, Mr. Wilson. I think, Mr. Wilson, and respectfully, I think the disconnect here, though, is that the people that ended up paying the price for that, in many ways during the course of this protest, were not actually the people enacting the laws, creating the regulations, but people who are just trying to live their lives, who are all of a sudden trapped in their home, and many of them not feeling safe to walk their own streets.
Well, Michael, I think that's why those who were trying to keep the protest peaceful urged the truckers that the time had come for them to move out of the downtown. And this is what civil disobedience is and lawful protests involves. It involves sometimes making government and people feel uncomfortable in response to the discomfort that the citizens felt by the government policy. So this is part of our democratic process, is that when people and citizens feel that a government's gone too far, is they engage in protest. And that's what happened. Was it of a grand scale? Yes. But it was spontaneous, and I think it was reflection of the depth of sentiment within Canadians that something had gone terribly wrong in our country, and the impact on their children with the school closures. Now, admittedly, the federal government didn't do that. But for those things that the federal government controlled, they felt they needed to come here and voice their concerns and ask for the rule of law and the charter to be respected.
So at the end of the day then, Mr. Wilson, what do you hope this inquiry flushes out?
Well, I hope the accurate information comes out, that we hear all perspectives. Really, the question for the inquiry is whether or not the freezing of bank accounts and the impact that that had on people and isolating them, and how that could be done so arbitrarily, and preventing them from paying mortgages and getting gas and getting groceries and medicines for their kids. The level of violence that we saw from the police during the clearing out of protesters on the Friday, and to a lesser extent Saturday, was that really justified? Why didn't the Prime Minister meet with the protesters and try and be proactive like Mayor Watson was in de-escalating the situation? I think those are questions that hopefully will get answered.
Keith Wilson, really appreciate the time today. Thank you for that.
Thank you, sir.
As we talk about the residents of Ottawa's Centretown neighborhood, without a doubt, many will have strong feelings about the Emergencies Act. More than 20,000 people live in the capital's downtown core, and among them, Ontario politician Joel Harden, who represents the riding of Ottawa Centre in the provincial parliament. Joel Harden joins us now. Mr. Harden, thanks for being here.
Hi, Michael. Nice to be here.
So we're going to talk about the inquiry in a moment, but before we get there, I was wondering if you could begin with the kind of behavior associated with the protest that was concerning, because Ottawa Centre is your community. Of the behavior that you saw, what concerned you the most?
Well, I just feel as if it was a climate where people were dehumanizing each other. I saw the Convoy protest roll across the country, Michael, and arrive here. Absolutely bound and determined to teach Prime Minister Trudeau a lesson, I guess, to make their point, and people are allowed to protest. But when you have the degree of folks intending to not only protest, but occupy our downtown, prevent people from getting around, prevent people from working, that created a climate of chaos, and not the kind of chaos that's associated with spontaneous protest. It made people legitimately fearful for their livelihoods. Many people lost pay. Many people felt harassed in their own neighborhoods. Even if that wasn't the intent of many of the protesters, that's how people lived here felt.
Let's pick up on that point, because at the time I was covering the story from an anchor desk in Toronto, and the stories I was hearing at the time talked about people being verbally harassed, some being subjected to sexist, misogynistic commentary. What did you hear from local residents, from people who who live in Centretown in Ottawa?
It was hard to keep up, Michael, honestly. The level of correspondence we were getting into our office by email and by phone, incidents, it was hard to keep up. And I think, essentially, we had gone through 2 years of a pandemic with serious sacrifices on behalf of many. And some of the folks who traveled across the country here were determined to make a point. And anytime they saw someone wearing a mask, that was, that person was seen as the enemy instead of a fellow Canadian. And that led to so many significant incidents of harassment. I also heard of many incidents of racism, folks who are not cisgendered like me, who are transgender, who are queer visibly, feeling like they couldn't walk safely to the gym, to their place of work in our community, particularly in Centretown. So I want to believe that most people who came here to protest against COVID policies, they didn't want to harass people. But the problem was, the general feeling of chaos gave cover to people who have hate in their heart, who are targeting some of our neighbors. And what I hope comes out in the inquiry is some serious deep thinking about how we as a country can disagree on policies, but can never let that level of hate and dehumanization surface again. Because I've seen it happen elsewhere in the world, and it never goes to a good place.
Mm-hmm. As you know, the actions of Ottawa police have come under huge scrutiny as a result of what took place during the Convoy protest. Could more aggressive action on the part of Ottawa police, do you think that might have mitigated what we saw?
Well, Michael, let's begin with maybe it was a bad idea to chaperone 500 vehicles into parking spots all over the downtown of Ottawa. I mean, who at the Ottawa police, who at senior levels of security in this country believed it was appropriate to let 500 vehicles permanently park and camp in the downtown core? Who believed, after everything we heard from the Convoy leaders, that these folks were going to leave after a few days? That is just not a credible argument. So I'm looking at the inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act. I'm looking at former Chief Slowly's comments. I'm looking at all security officials' comments. I'm looking at what the Convoy organizers are going to say about what they intended to do and how long they were prepared to stay. So it was an abject failure from a security standpoint to let people be chaperoned into the downtown. Any responsible owner-operator of a truck should have had their license and insurance policies pulled by the province of Ontario within a week of something like this. I guarantee you, Michael, if someone was protesting against climate change, if someone was protesting against any number of other subjects, any vehicles involved would have been moved within hours of it starting. But there was an asterisk to this movement. And I want to understand through this federal inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act, why was a double standard applied to this protest? And how can we make sure in the future, when debate gets heated in this country, that we can continue to see each other and not dehumanize each other, not throw each other under the bus?
Can I ask you, though, to define what that asterisk is? You say there's an asterisk attached to this protest. What do you fear it is?
Well, I've never known, Michael, of an occasion in the past, and I've attended many climate action events, for example. I've never known of any climate action events that have snarled the downtown for weeks on end, that our security forces were involved in donating to. But we now know that some members of the Ottawa Police Service donated to this cause late into it when people had missed work, when people had been intimidated into the streets. We know that members of the Ottawa Police, and they've been brought up on internal charges, not only let it happen, but contributed to making it happen. So this is really, I think, a reckoning for us. We pay our municipal taxes as folks who live in cities to make sure that public safety is looked after, is guaranteed. And that did not happen in this instance. It took weeks for action to happen from any level of government. And I truly believe that if it was a protest over any other matter, this would have been solved in hours. For some reason, this was unworkable for our security expertise here. So I know what got us through, Michael, was citizens looking after each other. It was the legal injunction that stopped the honking that was going on at 80 decibels. It was the Battle of Billings Bridge, where people, including myself, peacefully blockaded convoy vehicles and told them they were not welcome in our downtown any longer. And then finally, the security establishment began to catch up to what citizens were demanding of our police forces. So my memory of, go ahead, Michael.
Sorry, and I'm quickly losing time, but I do want to ask you then, given all that you've just said, at the heart of this inquiry is whether or not it was proper to invoke the Emergencies Act, whether or not it was appropriate or an overreach. When you hear that question, what goes through your mind? Was it legitimate?
I lean to no. I lean to not suspending civil liberties. I lean to not having the kinds of extreme measures that the Emergency Act requires the state to do. I believe that if the province of Ontario, Michael, frankly, acted like the province of Quebec did, we would not have had trucks parked here for weeks on end. In Quebec, they threatened to pull licenses, they threatened to pull insurance policies, and the trucks rolled into Montreal and Quebec City and left. But in Ottawa, the province of Ontario, Premier Ford, did not use those powers. And I'm shocked at the fact that there's really, from my understanding, only one party, the Deputy Solicitor General from Ontario, participating in this inquiry, because frankly, Ontario has a lot of questions it needs to answer. Because this won't be the first time we have a major security event. There will be others. So how do we make sure we can protest vigorously if necessary, but also not dehumanize or harass neighbors who may have a different view?
Joel Harden, thank you for the time today.
It's my pleasure, Michael. Be well.
So, Mr. Harden does not think the act should have been used, but as we said off top, security experts were concerned about certain elements within the protest and the violence they were promising to bring. Michael Kempa is a professor of criminology at the University of Ottawa. He joins us right now. Michael, good to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, you have been very clear in the past, you believe, or believed at least, that the government was justified in using the Emergencies Act. Why is that?
Well, it's very regrettable that it was necessary to mobilize the Emergencies Act. It was simply the case, though, that the normal chain of civil institutions, from municipal policing up through municipal government, provincial government, the federal security agencies, had not managed to bring the crisis under control. There were really no options left other than to mobilize the Emergencies Act, even though it should probably have never have gotten to that had our agencies been prepared in advance.
Had they been prepared? Now, was it just a matter, though, of giving them more time to respond rather than invoking the act?
wasn't a question of time to respond. Peter Slowly, the former chief of the Ottawa Police Service, gave very clear evidence on this last week to the Special Joint Committee in Parliament and the Senate on this matter, where he said most of the structural issues in our police organizations, in our different levels of government, we're simply not prepared for this magnitude of protest or crisis, and most of these structural issues have still not been repaired to this day. So it wasn't a matter of time in that moment. It was more a matter of really making sure that our police organizations are organized for this type of protest. Our security organizations are asking the right questions and gathering the right information, and that we are prepared moving forward, having had to invoke the Emergencies Act once.
Okay, well, let's go back then. If the structures were insufficient, if the right questions were not being asked, why those deficiencies? Why weren't they better prepared? Was this just something that Canada has never seen before?
Canada's not seen it before. Our security agencies have not been focused on domestic, ideological, violent extremist groups, both on the far left and the far right. We had been focused on terror issues external to Canada, most especially a preoccupation with what was known as Islamist terrorism, which is different from the Islamic faith, obviously. This type of grassroots violent political extremism, though, has been a problem in Canada for at least a decade, and a growing problem, and our agencies were simply not focused upon it. And when we saw it approaching last January and February and bedding down in Ottawa, at the borders across Canada, and especially in Coutts, Alberta, with the discovery of weapons, we were surprised by what we saw simply because we had not imagined that it was this degree of a problem in our own country.
Now, I think there's a disconnect, though, because, of course, people will see the coverage. They will hear security experts like yourself talk about the concerns around national security, the type of danger that was present. But for many protesters, those who came out to support protesters, they still will argue that they have a right to demonstrate, and for them it was a pushback on vaccine mandates because that's what they came out for. It wasn't for any other reason, political or otherwise. What would you say to that?
Well, people certainly do have a right to protest and freedom of expression in Canada. There were layers to this protest. There were very many thousands of people who came out to protest vaccine mandates. The problem that we have, though, is that protest and the freedom of movement of individuals does not extend to heavy machinery and trucks and blocking public roadways and preventing essentially cities from being able to do any of their business and citizens to go about their daily essentials. So we don't have an unlimited right to free movement. The police are allowed to control the flow of traffic in our society, to make sure that emergency vehicles are able to get through and that citizens can access essential services like pharmacies and doctors and so forth. One of the issues we have had, though, is we don't have clear legislation in Canada that draws the distinction between where protest is legal and where it breaks down. In other places, in the United Kingdom, they do have this legislation. It's very clear. And it does not set undue limits on people's ability to freely express their opinions or to move around in nonviolent protest.
Okay, so what are the limits? If you're pointing to the United Kingdom as an example, what limits does the UK have that Canada does not have on the freedom of assembly and to protest?
Well, the UK legislation is very clear on not using heavy machinery or other objects to block public thoroughfares, public roadways. They're very clear on not having weapons of convenience, so things like flagpoles and whatnot that can be quickly broken down to use as weapons in crowds. They're clearer on the limits of hate speech and speech which incites violence. We do have limits in Canada, but they are a little bit clearer in the United Kingdom. They are things that allow police to act with more confidence in breaking up protest when it does begin to cross the line into illegality, while not interfering with legal protest.
Okay, but you know, when you look at the charges that have come out of this action, they actually have nothing to do with violations of security. Instead, what we're looking at are mischief charges, nuisance charges. How do those crimes meet, or rather merit, the invocation of an Emergencies Act if, again, none of the charges laid have anything to do with security?
This is an essential question for the inquiry, and the tricky business for the public watching is simply that when you invoke the Emergencies Act, it enables the government to go into the law books to select certain tools to ramp up for a period of time. So in our case, we said this time certain areas were no-go protest zones. If you were participating in those zones or donating money to what was going on in those zones, you could have your accounts frozen and so forth. These were extraordinary powers that were basically designed to break up the crowd. When we're talking about laying charges, very often, even in a situation of emergency, Crown prosecutors and police will simply pursue the simplest charges that can be laid and taken up in the courts. So things like mischief, obstructing police officers, or assaulting police officers, these are straightforward charges that are easily prosecuted through our courts that do not require very complicated trials with very difficult standards of evidence. So the idea would be the Emergencies Act was for breaking up the crowd, but then in a sense, there's no reason to crush a butterfly on the wheel. Once you have people dispersed and you've only charged a small number of people, it's very often not necessary to use the most draconian laws for criminal prosecution. You can proceed with very simple charges that do not have enormous jail times associated with them, partially for the reason that you don't want to come down too heavily on people that may have a significant amount of public sympathy if you were to unnecessarily use huge laws against them in the courts.
But does that not undermine the justification for using the Act in the first place?
In a sense, it does. If there had been sufficient police officers in Ottawa with an adequate plan and procedures and policies in place to deal with a major protest such as what we saw in Ottawa, the enforcement of all of these conventional minor criminal offenses, mischief, damage to property, any forms of violence, open liquor, violation of moving violations for traffic in the city, it could have been broken up. The key being that these things were not in place. We did not have sufficient officers. We all saw OPS seeming to be hanging back, the auto police seeming to be hanging back for the justification that they said they would have been swarmed had they enforced many of these things. It got to the point where ordinary laws could not be used to break down up the crowd, and that's where the invocation of the Emergencies Act came into play. If we're ready next time, it should never again get to the point that the Emergencies Act would need to be mobilized for dealing with a protest of Canadian citizens in domestic territory.
Now, dozens of witnesses will be heard from in the weeks ahead. Is there any one or any group of particular witnesses that you're looking forward to hearing from?
They're all essential who are on the list. There was a bit of a debate. Should the organizers of the Freedom Convoy be given the platform to present their views in the inquiry? Absolutely they should. Canadians need to hear what is their side of the argument, what evidence have they got to support their claims that they were only here for a peaceable protest to do with COVID-19. They must answer questions to do with which streams of organization were tied to events in Coutts, Alberta. Was there coordination between the protests in Ottawa and the blockades of the essential crossings into the United States? Canadians must see and hear the evidence that these groups have and judge it for themselves.
Michael, really appreciate your thoughts once again. Thank you for the time today.
Thank you kindly.
That's Michael Kempa. And we will stay with this story for you in the coming weeks. The Public Order Emergency Commission officially begins tomorrow. We'll have special programming for you as it gets underway at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for the next 6 weeks, we will update you. We'll also bring you live coverage of testimony. You can see that right here on CPAC, and we will live stream the full work of the Commission for you on our website, cpac.ca. I'm Michael Serapio. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.